Hello and welcome to the third lecture as part of the Open University's MOOC on genocide. In this lecture, we will focus on some key terms related to the study of genocide and talk about the preconditions for genocide, conditions that normally emerge before the actual occurrence of genocide. Not all these prerequisites occur all the time, sometimes only some of them do. But I'll tell you about the things we generally look for in our research, even retroactively, to find out what caused the genocide in question. And when we try to identify the scenario that leads to genocide and try to avoid it, there are some preconditions that may help us decide whether a certain scenario leads to a genocide or something else. But first, some basic concepts. In the previous lecture, we talked about the concept of genocide, coined by Raphael Lemkin. You may remember that the literal meaning of the word genocide is murder of a whole people. According to the UN Convention we read in the previous lecture, genocide is an event against a racial, ethnic, national or religious group. You remember the problematic omission of political groups of the final document of the UN Convention of 1948, which created a semantic problem for genocide scholars who actually can't deem the persecution of people for their political affiliation as genocide. And in fact, if we look at different cases of genocide in the last 100 years, politically based persecution of people is perhaps the most striking, at least in terms of the number of victims, be it in Stalin's Soviet Union, Mao Zedong's China, Cambodia under Pol Pot's regime and his Khmer Rouge party, or a host of other cases where droves of people were exterminated for being affiliated with the wrong political group according to the regime at the time. To resolve this particular dissonance, we use a specific term for politically based persecution in our research, politicide, as in murder on a political basis. Another term I want to draw your attention to, ethnocide, but unlike the meaning it may reflexively evoke, it doesn't refer to the murder of people because they belong to an ethnic group. After all, that is already covered by the UN Convention itself. When we say ethnocide, we mean the destruction of a culture. This term means the attempt to destroy the culture of a certain human group without physically hurting its members. We see quite a few cases in history where a particular group of people wants to destroy the culture of another group without physically eliminating it, and this is the term we use to describe an event like that. When we notice an attempt by a particular group or regime to ban the worship of a particular religion in the country they control, we call that ethnocide. When we see an attempt by the regime to prohibit use of a particular language or dialect, this too meets the same criteria of ethnocide in terms of our genocide research. In that sense, ethnocide is genocide for all intents and purposes, even if it doesn't entail physical harm to anyone. So these are the three key concepts with which we set out. Genocide, the murder of groups of people, be it national, ethnic, racial or religious groups. Politicide, the killing of people because they belong to a political group. Or ethnocide, the elimination of a culture. During our course in the coming weeks, we'll observe several case studies and I will try to link between these terms and the case studies. I'd like to talk to you now for a few minutes about the preconditions for genocide. As I mentioned before, these conditions, which I will describe to you in the next few minutes, do not necessarily exist nor have existed in the past in every case of genocide, but we see that at least some of them always apply in every case of genocide, and I will present this method to you in general. Often when we see genocide emerging, or when we can retrospectively trace the way a regime planned and executed genocide, if we have the tools to do so, we notice similar things happening at different times on different continents and in different centuries and cultures. One of the most notable things in the almost self-evident fact that genocide always has perpetrators and victims. This is seemingly obvious, but perhaps what's less obvious is the fact that in almost every case, the perpetrators belong to the majority group of the population, which has the most power, if not the ultimate power in the said country. Both in terms of military, administration, what have you, every aspect. The victims are almost always a powerless minority group that cannot defend itself. I think the Holocaust of European Jewry completely fits this description. If we're looking for a concrete example, consider the power of Nazi Germany and the fact that the Jews were a powerless minority everywhere the Germans occupied. No need to elaborate on that point, I believe it is understood. We see similar phenomena in the Rwandan genocide, where the majority group, the Hutu, had absolute power in the country, and the group that was persecuted and murdered in 1994, the Tutsi, was a powerless minority group in every respect, unable to defend itself in any way. Another phenomenon we see in cases of genocide, when a government, regime, or most powerful group plan to attack a helpless minority, is usually an attempt by the regime to differentiate between the majority group, us, and the minority group they're about to attack. This differentiation can take form by external labeling. For example, the yellow star Jews were forced to wear by Nazi Germany, or the pink patches homosexuals were forced to wear, or the patches gypsies were ordered to wear during World War II. But labeling and differentiation can also take form secretly, for example, by conducting a census of the population which only the regime has access to, including marking certain names of people in advance, their addresses, the names of their spouses, their children, or their jobs, in order to be able to reach them as quickly as possible and eliminate them in the fastest and most effective way. We also see various attempts by various regimes to differentiate between the future perpetrators and future victims through psychological measures too, rather than the measures of actual physical separation. Let me tell you about two terms related to this kind of experience and maybe a few other things in this regard, but first and foremost, a term we use in the study of genocide called dehumanization. That is the negation of the humanity of the group that's about to be attacked. What does this term, dehumanization, mean? Perhaps you've seen one of the most famous movies filmed in Nazi Germany, a movie called The Eternal Jew. Perhaps you remember the parts where they suddenly show swarms of rats running in the sewers, practically nose-sitting the viewers alongside the main characters of this movie images of Jews. This is obviously a psychological attempt to plant in the viewer's subconscious this equation: the Jews are equal to disease-spreading rats. This image actually tries to compare a group of people to a group of rodents. In this case, Jews equal rats. It's a classic example of dehumanization, the negation of the humanity of that group. In this case, the goal is to make the future perpetrators consider the future victims not real people like them, but rather inferior. Okay, maybe they are not really rats, they walk on two legs and have a person's face, but they are not really human beings like us. They are something inferior. Here's another example from the Rwandan genocide in 1994. Many years before the genocide, the perpetrators, the Hutu majority group, called the Tutsi, the future victims, cockroaches. They called the Tutsi by this name for a very long time, and this too is a striking example of the dehumanization process. If we plan a genocide and convince the majority group, our own group, that the group we are going to attack in the future is not really a group of people, this will make it easier for the future murderers to exterminate defenseless women, children, and old men, groups of civilians, which would otherwise be more difficult for them to do. This is the aim of the dehumanization process. In that respect, we also talk about demonization process in various cases of genocide, as in the word demon. This term is used in order to paint an entire group in satanic colors. All Jews are actually traitors. All Tutsi are traitors to the nation and backstabbers, and so forth. This too is very common in preparation processes for genocide, as the regime uses propaganda against the group of future victims. Let me also direct your attention to a tactic we call scapegoating, when the regime marks the group of future victims and claims to the majority group of future perpetrators that the said group is guilty of all the disasters inflicted the country. If we go back to the example of Nazi Germany, the Jews and Hitler, One of Adolf Hitler's main arguments against the Jews, back from the days when he wrote Mein Kampf in 1924, was that Germany lost World War I because the Jews had stabbed the nation in the back. All Jews were blamed for Germany's defeat. This, of course, is absolute nonsense, but when repeated many times, eventually it becomes something that many people might believe. Finally, we see the term ancient hatred take form in various cases of genocide, when two groups of people living side by side in the same country become hostile towards each other, though the conditions for this hostility to become violent are not in place, be it because the regime doesn't allow it or the social and environmental conditions don't allow it. Sometimes such ancient hatred and hostility remain dormant for decades, sometimes even more, and then suddenly the conditions emerge that allow this hatred to burst out again. And suddenly we see Group X attacking Group Y for reasons originating from hundreds of years earlier. Animosity between religious groups, ethnic groups, nationalities, etc. That's all for now. See you at the 4th lecture later this week. Meanwhile, goodbye and see you later.